together, so you're not on that. Okay, so yesterday we said the Indian of Mayim, Rabim, mighty waters that cannot extinguish the love. The love is the Ava Mesuteres, the hidden love inside of every Jew. That even the waters of the machshava of Parnasa, Shibud HaParnasa, being enslaved by the physicality that was put upon us when our souls came into physical bodies, which is a constant barrage of B'chule, this cannot extinguish the love that the soul has, because the soul is naturally like a flame drawn to rejoin to its source and cling to God and be in a state of devekis to Hashem. And that's its natural state above, and even when it comes below, it doesn't lose that natural state. So we said the flood, on the contrary, the flood of physicality, really only serves in truth to elevate it. And we see that indicated by the words Mayim Noach, that the flood itself is called waters of Noach. Seemingly they should be called waters of destruction or something. But in order to show you that they're actually there, in order to elevate the soul, that through the physicality and through this Mayim Rabim, you can actually go higher, and through all of our problems and all of our tzaras and all of our worries and all of our this, that, the other thing, which don't need to be enumerated because you'd never end, through them actually, they become May Noach, they become May Shabbat, because Noach is the translation of Shabbos, of rest, which means that they serve to elevate you, just like Shabbos, the person who rests from his work, and the contraction, the confinement of the 6 days of the week sort of ends and he goes back into a state of elevation. Shabbos Aliyas Ha'olamos, the worlds elevate, so too these waters enable us to elevate. So we said the waters themselves were a purifying waters. That's why Hashem decided to destroy the world, as it were, with a big flood, as opposed to just, remove everyone one from one, or all at once from the earth, which would have been a cleaner job. But 40 days of rain equals 40 saw of a mikveh, the measure of a mikveh. And the flood waters was basically a purification of the earth to bring the earth to a state of elevation. So the details basically of how this physical world and the Gashmias actually does elevate you, he says that it basically comes about through meditation. That if a person, after he goes through all this work day and all the bothers of the Parnasa, if afterwards, which is called darkness basically, if afterwards he takes a minute and meditates during prayer, and this is where we left off basically, like what's going to happen to you when you meditate during prayer. So we said, what is the meditation first of all during prayer? What is it? How is it that we elevate enable these floodwaters to elevate us? So after we're inundated with them, we take a moment and reflect in prayer on the following. And we said that there's no piece of blade of grass below that doesn't have a mazel above, some spiritual force above striking it, telling it to grow. By the way, we spoke about at the beginning of class yesterday that this is the oral Torah to the Tanya, which is the written Torah. So if you read yesterday's Tanya, it mentioned this exact thing. It's like it doesn't go into it in as much detail, but it talked about the idea of the 70 ministering angels. You read yesterday's Tanya? Anyway? So we're going to go into this concept over here. Anyway, we'll see it right now. And he says that what does it mean that every blade of grass down here is struck by a mazel, which tells it to grow? So he says these mazalos represent shehem hamashpim chayos kol olam hazeh. The mazalos are that force, basically. He's talking about basically the real stars, the solar system, right? All the different stars in the sky and all the different planets. These are called the mazalos. And they are giving over a life force to this world. Of course, the life force isn't generated by them, but nonetheless, the way Hashem operates His universe is that He contracts. Maybe it's the smoking? No, because when he smoked in other places, it didn't affect him so bad. Anyway, so he says like this. that these mazalos, these planetary forces, they give over chayis to olam hazeh. In other words, from the sun, the moon, the different planets, each one of them has, and there's like millions of them, right? Each one of them has its influence on Earth and literally directs the traffic, as it were. Of course, they're just like a axe in the hand of the wood chopper. They don't have any power of their own. But this is how Hashem brings and infuses energy into this world. As it says, "Mimeged tvu hashamesh umeged geresh dirachim." As it says in the pasuk we just had in Zos HaBracha, that the different things which were in, I think, Yosef's plot that grow. Some of them grow from the sun, some of them grow from the moon. Each thing has its own mazel. That's what it means, a mazel. In other words, there's also a spiritual concept that the mazalos are spiritual forces. But on a very down-to-earth, basic level, there's like the whole concept of astrology and so forth, which is, to a certain degree, very much in effect, not necessarily on Jews as much. But the whole world is basically like a little puppet show from these forces from above, which give energy into and enliven the things from below. So certain things grow from the power of the sun, certain things grow from the power of the moon, and so it goes. But mazalos hem makablim ayin sari. But then the mazalos themselves are just like a puppet show. They're also just puppets. Because above them there's a higher spiritual force which is conducting the stars. This is called the Seder Ishtalshlus, the order of the chain-like descent of the world. And those are called the ayin sarim, the 70 ministers. These are sort of like ministering angels, certain forces which direct the nations. We're on the third line down. This column here, this first column. Right? And this is where we hear mention of these sarim in different places. Like, for example, it says that when Egypt came, Mitzrayim came, chasing after us at the sea, the Egyptians, they're called there in a singular word. In other words, instead of all the Egyptians, said like the Egyptians as a singular being. And it says because the Jewish people saw the sar of the Egyptians coming after them, like their ministering angel. There's 70 ministering forces, which in then conduct all the solar system, and the solar system then conducts these nations. So in other words, if a person really knew what they were doing, they would know all the details about a certain nation from looking at the stars, because they could see the source of it, and from that they could deduce that there's a spiritual force called the ministering angel, and they could basically see how he works. It's almost as though the certain planetary structure is like the body, and the sar, this ministering angel which is above it, is like the soul which conducts a certain one of the 70 nations. And in fact, we're going to come soon to Parshas Lech Lecha. In the beginning of the Zohar, Parshas Lech Lecha, it opens up by saying, where suddenly Hashem says to Avram, Lech Lecha. And it kind of comes out of nowhere, because in the end of Parshat Noach, you don't hear like a whole long relationship that's being formed between Avram and Hashem. It's just like sort of Avram's born, and you don't really know what's going on. Suddenly, we launch into this fantastic relationship, which goes for Parshas, that Avram is like the chosen one, and Hashem speaks to him directly and says, go forth from your land. What happened that he told him Lech Lecha suddenly? The Zohar says the background in the Midrash of what's happening is that Avram means Avram, we'll get to it in Parshas Lech Lecha, but it means exalted. Av is father, which means Chochmah. Ram means exalted, which means he was a brilliant genius beyond comprehension. And what was his brilliance is that he sat and figured out how every nation was governed by their stars. And he was able to figure out exactly what was going to be with every person, basically, every nation, how they functioned, what they were going to do next, and so forth, from looking at their stars, basically, from looking at what was going to be with them. But beyond comprehension, right? He was an astrologer, right? He was a stargazer. But what happened? He realized there was one constellation that governed all the others, and that was the one that he couldn't figure out how it worked. And that was the constellation that governed Eretz Yisrael, the land and the people of Eretz Yisrael. So he couldn't figure out, after all the brilliance, he only understood the first 70, and he couldn't understand this one which controlled all the other ones. So that's when Hashem came to him and he says, Lech Lecha. He says, you're never going to understand it unless you go there. So he knows he had to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's what the whole Zohar, according to the Zohar, that's how the whole parsha begins, Lech Lecha, because he came to a certain perfection of creation, When it came to Eretz Yisrael,